A joint stock company is a business entity where different stakes can be bought and owned by shareholders. Each shareholder owns company stock in proportion, evidenced by his or her shares. This allows for the unequal ownership of a business, with some shareholders owning a larger proportion of a company than others. Shareholders are able to transfer their shares to others without any effects to the continued existence of the company. In modern corporate law, the existence of a joint stock company is often synonymous with incorporation and limited liability. And as a consequence, joint stock companies are commonly known as corporations or limited companies. Some jurisdictions still provide the possibility of registering joint stock companies without limited liability. In the United Kingdom and other countries which have adopted their model of company law, these are known as unlimited companies. In the United States, they are known simply as joint stock companies. Advantages: ownership of stock confers a large number of privileges. The company is managed on behalf of the shareholders by a board of directors, elected at an annual general meeting. The shareholders also vote to accept or reject an annual report and audited set of accounts. Individual shareholders can sometimes stand for directorships within the company, should a vacancy occur, but this is uncommon. The shareholders are usually liable for any of the company debts that exceed the company's ability to pay. Meanwhile, the limit of their liability only extends to the face value of their shareholding. This concept of limited liability largely accounts for the success of this form of business organization. Ordinary shares entitle the owner to a share in the company's net profit. This is calculated in the following way: the net profit is divided by the total number of owned shares, producing a notional value per share, known as a dividend. The individual's share of the profit is thus the dividend multiplied by the number of shares that they own. Early joint stock companies. Finding the earliest joint stock company is a matter of definition. Around 1250 in France at Toulouse, 96 shares of the Société Coopérative Copyright des Moulins du Bazacle, or Bazacle Milling Company, were traded at a value that depended on the profitability of the mills the society owned, making it probably the first company of its kind in history. The Swedish company Stora has documented a stock transferred for 1/8 of the company as early as 1288. In more recent history, the earliest joint stock company recognized in England was the Company of Merchant Adventurers to New Lands, chartered in 1553 with 250 shareholders. Russia's Muscovy Company, which had a monopoly on trade between Moscow and London, was chartered soon after in 1555. The much more famous, wealthy and powerful English East India Company was granted an English royal charter by Elizabeth I on December 31, 1600, with the intention of favouring trade privileges in India. The royal charter effectively gave the newly created Honourable East India Company a 15-year monopoly on all trade in the East Indies. The company transformed from a commercial trading venture to one that ruled India and exploited its resources as it acquired auxiliary governmental and military functions, until its dissolution. Soon afterwards, in 1602, the Dutch East India Company issued shares that were made tradable on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. This invention enhanced the ability of joint stock companies to attract capital from investors, as they could now easily dispose their shares. During the period of colonialism, Europeans, initially the British, trading with the Near East for goods, pepper and calico for example, enjoyed spreading the risk of trade over multiple sea voyages. The joint stock company became a more viable financial structure than previous guilds or state-regulated companies. The first joint stock companies to be implemented in the Americas were the London Company and the Plymouth Company. Transferable shares often earn positive returns on equity, which is evidenced by investment in companies like the British East India Company, which used the financing model to manage trade in India. Joint stock companies paid out divisions to their shareholders by dividing up the profits of the voyage in the proportion of shares held. Divisions were usually cash, but when working capital was low and it was detrimental to the survival of the company, divisions were either postponed or paid out in remaining cargo which could be sold by shareholders for profit. However, in general, incorporation was only possible by royal charter or private act, and was limited owing to the government's jealous protection of the privileges and advantages thereby granted. As a result of the rapid expansion of capital-intensive enterprises in the course of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, many businesses came to be operated as unincorporated associations or extended partnerships, with large numbers of members. Nevertheless, membership of such associations was usually short-term, so their nature was constantly changing. Consequently, registration and incorporation of companies without specific legislation was introduced by the Joint Stock Companies Act 1844. Initially, companies incorporated under this act did not have limited liability, although it became common for companies to include a limited liability clause in their internal rules. In the case of Hallett v. Dowdall, the English Court of the Exchequer held that such clauses bound people who have notice of them. 4 years later, the Joint Stock Companies Act 1856 provided for limited liability for all joint stock companies, provided, among other things, that they include the word limited in their company name. The landmark case of Salomon v. A. Salomon and Company Limited established that a company with legal liability, not being a partnership, had a distinct legal personality, separate from that of its individual shareholders. Corporate law. The existence of a corporation requires a special legal framework and body of law that specifically grants the corporation legal personality, and typically views a corporation as a fictional person, a legal person, or a moral person. Corporate statutes typically empower corporations to own property, sign binding contracts, and pay taxes in a capacity separate from that of its shareholders. According to Lord Chancellor Haldane, a corporation is an abstraction. It has no mind of its own any more than it has a body of its own. Its active and directing will must consequently be sought in the person of somebody who is really the directing mind and will of the corporation, the very ego and center of the personality of the corporation. The legal personality has two economic implications. First, it grants creditors priority over the corporate assets upon liquidation. Second, corporate assets cannot be withdrawn by its shareholders, nor can the assets of the firm be taken by personal creditors of its shareholders. The second feature requires special legislation and a special legal framework, as it cannot be reproduced via standard contract law. The regulations most favorable to incorporation include financial disclosure. In many jurisdictions, corporations whose shareholders benefit from limited liability are required to publish annual financial statements and other data, so that creditors who do business with the corporation are able to assess the creditworthiness of the corporation and cannot enforce claims against shareholders. Shareholders therefore experience some loss of privacy in return for limited liability. This requirement generally applies in Europe, but not in Anglo-American jurisdictions, except for publicly traded corporations, where financial disclosure is required for investor protection. Corporate taxation. In many countries, corporate profits are taxed at a corporate tax rate, and dividends paid to shareholders are taxed at a separate rate. Such a system is sometimes referred to as double taxation, because any profits distributed to shareholders will eventually be taxed twice. One solution to this is for the recipient of the dividend to be entitled to a tax credit which addresses the fact that the profits represented by the dividend have already been taxed. The company profit being passed on is therefore effectively only taxed at the rate of tax paid by the eventual recipient of the dividend. In other systems, dividends are taxed at a lower rate than other income, or shareholders are taxed directly on the corporation's profits and dividends are not taxed. Closely held corporations and publicly traded corporations. The institution most often referenced by the word corporation is a publicly traded corporation, the shares of which are traded on a public stock exchange where shares of stock of corporations are bought and sold by and to the general public. Most of the largest businesses in the world are publicly traded corporations. However, the majority of corporations are said to be closely held, privately held or closed corporations, meaning that no ready market exists for the trading of shares. Many such corporations are owned and managed by a small group of business people or companies, although the size of such a corporation can be as vast as the largest public corporations. Closely held corporations do have some advantages over publicly traded corporations. A small, closely held company can often make company-changing decisions much more rapidly than a publicly traded company, because there will generally be fewer voting shareholders or the shareholders would have common interests. A publicly traded company is also at the mercy of the market, having capital flow in and out based not only on what the company is doing but also on what the market and even what the competitors, major and minor, are doing. Publicly traded companies also have advantages over their closely held counterparts. Publicly traded companies often have more working capital and can delegate debt throughout all shareholders. This means shareholders of publicly traded company will each take a much smaller hit to their returns as opposed to those involved with a closely held corporation. Publicly traded companies though suffer from this exact advantage. A closely held corporation can often voluntarily take a hit to profit with little to no repercussions. A publicly traded company though often comes under extreme scrutiny if profit and growth are not evident to stockholders, thus stockholders may sell, further damaging the company. Often this blow is enough to make a small public company fail. Often communities benefit from a closely held company more so than from a public company. A closely held company is far more likely to stay in a single place that has treated them well, even if going through hard times. The shareholders can incur some of the damage the company may receive from a bad year or slow period in the company profits. Closely held companies often have a better relationship with workers. In larger, publicly traded companies, often when a year has gone badly, the first area to feel the effects are the workforce with layoffs or worker hours, wages or benefits being cut. Again, in a closely held business the shareholders can incur this profit damage rather than passing it to the workers. The affairs of publicly traded and closely held corporations are similar in many respects. The main difference in most countries is that publicly traded corporations have the burden of complying with additional securities laws, which may require additional periodic disclosure, stricter corporate governance standards, and additional procedural obligations in connection with major corporate transactions or events. A closely held corporation may be a subsidiary of another corporation, which may itself be either a closely held or a public corporation. In some jurisdictions, the subsidiary of a listed public corporation is also defined as a public corporation. By country, Australia. In Australia, corporations are registered and regulated by the Commonwealth Government through the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. Corporations law has been largely codified in the Corporations Act 2001. Brazil. In Brazil there are many different types of legal entities, but the two most common ones commercially speaking are, Sociedade Limitada, identified by LTDA, or Limitada after the company's name, equivalent to the British Limited Liability Company, and Sociedade Anônima, or Company, identified by SA, or Company in the company's name, equivalent to the British Public Limited Company. The LTDA is mainly governed by the new Civil Code, enacted in 2002, and the SA by the Law 6.404 dated December 15, 1976, as amended. Canada. In Canada both the federal government and the provinces have corporate statutes, and thus a corporation may have a provincial or a federal charter. Many older corporations in Canada stem from Acts of Parliament passed before the introduction of General Corporation Law. The oldest corporation in Canada is the Hudson's Bay Company. Though its business has always been based in Canada, its royal charter was issued in England by King Charles II in 1670. And became a Canadian charter by amendment in 1970 when it moved its corporate headquarters from London to Canada. Federally recognized corporations are regulated by the Canada Business Corporations Act. German-speaking countries. Germany, Austria, Switzerland and Liechtenstein recognize two forms of company limited by shares, the Aktiengesellschaft, analogous to public limited companies in the English-speaking world, and the Gesellschaft mit Beschränkter NKTE Haftung, similar to the modern private limited company. Italy. Italy recognizes three types of company limited by shares, the public limited company, the private limited company, and the publicly traded partnership. The latter is a hybrid of the limited partnership and public limited company, having two categories of shareholders, some with and some without limited liability, and is rarely used in practice. Japan. In Japan, Both the state and local public entities under the local autonomy law on municipalities are considered to be corporations. Non-profit corporations may be established under the Civil Code. The term company is used to refer to business corporations. The predominant form is the Kubashiki Kesha, used by public corporations as well as smaller enterprises. Moshibun Kesha, a form for smaller enterprises, are becoming increasingly common. Between 2002 and 2008, the intermediary corporation existed to bridge the gap between for-profit companies and non-governmental and non-profit organizations. Norway. In Norway, a joint stock company is called an aksjeselskap, abbreviated AS. A special and by far less common form of joint stock companies, intended for companies with a large number of shareholders, is the publicly traded joint stock companies, called allmenningsgeselskap and abbreviated ASA. A joint stock company must be incorporated, has an independent legal personality and limited liability, and is required to have a certain capital upon incorporation. Ordinary joint stock companies must have a minimum capital of 30,000 Norwegian krone upon incorporation, which was reduced from 100,000 in 2012. Publicly traded joint stock companies must have a minimum capital of 1 million Norwegian krone. Spain. In Spain there are two types of companies, with limited liability called SL, or Sociedad Limitada, and SA, or Sociedad Anónima. United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, corporation most commonly refers to a body corporate formed by royal charter or by statute, of which few now remain. The BBC is the oldest and best-known corporation within the UK that is still in existence. Others, such as the British Steel Corporation, were privatised in the 1980s. In the private sector, corporations are referred to as companies, and are regulated by the Companies Act 2006. The most common type of company is the private limited company. Private limited companies can either be limited by shares or by guarantee. Other corporate forms include the public limited company and the private unlimited company, and companies limited by guarantee. A special type of corporation is a corporation sole, which is an office held by an individual natural person, but which has a continuing legal entity separate from that person. United States. Several types of conventional corporations exist in the United States. Generically, any business entity that is recognized as distinct from the people who own it is a corporation. This generic label includes entities that are known by such legal labels as a Euro Association, a Euro Unregistered Trademark, a Euro Organization, a Euro Unregistered Trademark and a Euro Limited Liability Company, a Euro Unregistered Trademark, as well as corporations proper. Only a company that has been formally incorporated according to the laws of a particular state is called a Euro Corporation, a Euro Unregistered Trademark. A corporation was defined in the Dartmouth College case of 1819, in which Chief Justice Marshall of the United States Supreme Court stated that a corporation is an artificial being, invisible, intangible, and existing only in contemplation of the law. A corporation is a legal entity, distinct and separate from the individuals who create and operate it. As a legal entity, the corporation can acquire, own, and dispose of property in its own name like buildings, land and equipment. It can also incur liabilities and enter into contracts like franchising and leasing. American corporations can be either profit-making companies or non-profit entities. Tax-exempt non-profit corporations are often called a Euro A501(c)(3) corporation, a Euro, after the section of the Internal Revenue Code that addresses the tax exemption for many of them. In some states, such as Colorado, a corporation may represent itself pro se in courts of law. In some situations, the federal government can only create corporate entities pursuant to relevant powers in the U.S. Constitution. For example, Congress has constitutional power to provide postal services, so it has power to operate the United States Postal Service. Although the federal government could theoretically preempt all state corporate law under the court's current expansive interpretation of the Commerce Clause, it has chosen not to do so. As a result, much of American corporate law continues to be a matter of state law under the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Thus, virtually all corporations in the U.S. are incorporated under the laws of a particular state. All states have some kind of general corporation law, which authorizes the formation of private corporations without having to obtain a charter for each one from the state legislature. Many states have separate, self-contained laws authorizing the formation and operation of certain specific types of corporations that are wholly independent of the state general corporation law. For example, in California, non-profit corporations are incorporated under the non-profit corporation law, and in Illinois, insurers are incorporated under the Illinois Insurance Code. Corporations are created by filing the requisite documents with a particular state government. The process is called a Incorporation, a euro referring to the abstract concept of clothing the entity with a veil of artificial personhood. Only certain corporations, including banks, are chartered. Others simply file their articles of incorporation with the state government as part of a registration process. Once incorporated, a corporation has artificial personhood everywhere it may operate, until such time as the corporation may be dissolved. A corporation that operates in one state while being incorporated in another is a foreign corporation. This label also applies to corporations incorporated outside of the United States. Foreign corporations must usually register with the Secretary of State unregistered trademark's office in each state to lawfully conduct business in that state. A corporation is legally a citizen of the state in which it is incorporated. Corporate business law differs dramatically from state to state. Many prospective corporations choose to incorporate in a state whose laws are most favorable to its business interests. Many large corporations are incorporated in Delaware, for example, without being physically located there because that state has very favorable corporate tax and disclosure laws. Companies set up for privacy or asset protection often incorporate in Nevada, which does not require disclosure of share ownership. Many states, particularly smaller ones, have modeled their corporate statutes after the Model Business Corporation Act, one of many model sets of law prepared and published by the American Bar Association. As juristic persons, corporations have certain rights that attach to natural persons. The vast majority of them attach to corporations under state law, especially the law of the state in which the company is incorporated since the corporation's very existence is predicated on the laws of that state. A few rights also attach by federal constitutional and statutory law, but they are few and far between compared to the rights of natural persons. For example, a corporation has the personal right to bring a lawsuit and, like a natural person, a corporation can be libeled. Harvard College, formerly the President and Fellows of Harvard College, is the oldest corporation in the Western Hemisphere. Founded in 1636, the second of Harvard unregistered trademark's two governing boards was incorporated by the Great and General Court of Massachusetts in 1650. Significantly, Massachusetts itself was a corporate colony at that time owned and operated by the Massachusetts Bay Company, so Harvard College is a corporation created by a corporation. Many nations have modeled their own corporate laws on American business law. Corporate law in Saudi Arabia, for example, follows the model of New York State corporate law. In addition to typical corporations in the United States, the federal government, in 1971 passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which authorized the creation of 12 regional native corporations for Alaska Natives and over 200 village corporations that were entitled to a settlement of land and cash. In addition to the 12 regional corporations, the legislation permitted a 13th regional corporation without a land settlement for those Alaska Natives living out of the state of Alaska at the time of passage of ANCSA. Other business entities. Almost every recognized type of organization carries out some economic activities. Other organizations that may carry out activities that are generally considered to be business exist under the laws of various countries. These include consumers cooperative, holding company, limited liability company, limited liability limited partnership, limited partnership, low-profit limited liability company, not-for-profit corporation, partnership, sole proprietorship, Trust company, trust law, see also. Actiesselskab, types of business entity, references, notes. Further reading, Davis, J.S. Essays in the Earlier History of American Corporations. Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press. Ekeland, R.B. and Tollison, R.D. Mercantilist Origins of the Corporation. Bell Journal of Economics 11, 715 Euro 720 doi, 10.2307/3003390. JSTORA 3003390. Fisher, F.J. Some Experiments in Company Organization in the Early 17th Century. Economic History Review 4, 177 Euro 194 doi, 10.2307/2590601. JSTORA 2590601. Friedman, C.E. Joint Stock Enterprise in France 1807 Euro 1867, From Privileged Company to Modern Corporation. Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press. Hunt, B.C. The Development of the Business Corporation in England, 1800 Euro 1867. Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press. Lobban, M. Corporate Identity and Limited Liability in France and England 1825-67. Anglo-American Law Review 25, 397 Mason, S.W.A.L. Mason, French and Ryan on Company Law. London, Oxford University Press. ISBN A0-19-928531-4. External links, The History of the Corporate Business Firm.